So hello everybody and welcome back to this Marketing Management MBA. So we're getting quite far into the sessions now. So this particular session is session 8, all around the area of management policy and strategy. But in this particular module, we're going to be focusing more at analysing the external environment. So this is a really important part in strategic management, as the external environment is the context in which a business operates. So every factor can have an effect on the business in a positive or a negative way, and therefore companies make plans and strategies to try to anticipate these effects. So if we don't look at the external environment and the changes which are going to occur within that environment, then as an organisation we may potentially miss opportunities to grow or suffer setbacks. For example, losing business to a competitor. So it's really highly important that we learn some tools and techniques to understand what is going on in the external environment. So in this particular session, we're going to be looking at analysing a company's external environment from the environmental appraisal aspect, from scenario planning, from preparing an environmental threat and opportunity profile, from analysing the industry. So we've come across Porter, so we're going to be looking at a little bit more detail in Porter's 5 forces model of competition. So how do we analyse what's going on in the environment? So you may have come across the term PESTLE before. So PESTLE responds or looks at what's going on in terms of political pressures. So what's the current political climate? It also looks at what's happening in the economy, so the impact of local, national and world economy. Socio-cultural, so the ways in which changes in society affect the organisation. It also looks at the technological side, so the effect of new and emerging technology. Environmental, so what's happening on the local, national and world environmental scale. And legal factors, so the effect of legislation in both the UK and other countries. So I'm sure PESTLE is already known to you as a way of analysing the external environment. So once we've done our external environment analysis, that will then lead us to set some vision, missions and objectives, which we looked at earlier sessions, goals, systems, structures and targets, which will then lead to some kind of input and resources. And we can kind of classify those input and resources around what we call the 5 M's. And the 5 M's stand for manpower, materials, machinery, minutes, obviously as in time, and money. So once we have then set our vision, mission, objectives, that then leads to our inputs, which then lead to things such as processes, planning, manufacturing, inspection and packing, which will then lead to outputs in terms of sales, service, transport of goods, etc. and profits. And then as you can see, we have some sort of continuous feedback loop, because the feedback that we get from that will then in turn drive re-establishing or perhaps revisiting our vision, our mission, our objectives and goals to make sure they're in alignment. And coming out of that in turn could potentially be some kind of corrective actions. So depending on what the feedback tells us, that will then lead to inputs, which will lead to processes, which may potentially lead to changes in the way that we conduct manufacturing, planning or inspection based on that feedback. So we can see that there's a kind of a continuous kind of communication loop between what's going on inside the organisation and then finding out what the external environment is telling us, and then in turn responding to that. So making sure that we're in alignment with what the feedback is giving us. So corporate scenario planning is quite an important part of understanding the external environment. So corporate scenarios are kind of pro forma balance sheets and income statements that forecast the effect alternative strategies will have, and the various programs also will have on division and on corporate return on investment. So recommended scenarios are basically an extension of the industry scenarios that we discussed earlier, and they should be done for every product and for every country. So one way of doing that is developing common size financial statements for the company or business units previous years, which are then the basis for analysing the trend projections of financial statements or the pro forma financial statements. So looking at what's going on and how the organisation has changed, and basing those analysis on a way of projecting what's going to happen in the future. Another way of doing that is constructing detailed pro forma financial statements for each of these strategic alternatives that the organisation comes up with. And then what can happen is the organisation can compare the assumptions underlining the scenarios with these financial statements and ratios to determine the feasibility of these scenarios. So scenarios are tools, really useful tools for strategists. If you remember in previous sessions, we talked about the different people involved in planning strategy, and we called them strategists. So these are really useful tools for strategists to express their views about alternative future environment, or about the alternative future environment for which today's decisions will be framed. So these scenarios kind of resemble a set of stories built around carefully constructed plots. And the stories express multiple viewpoints and paradigms on complex events taking place in the world. And they kind of present alternative future images instead of extrapolating from current trends. So it's very much, as we said, about analysing trends that have taken place in the past and seeing patterns to then predict potential future scenarios. And creating these scenarios requires decision makers to question their broadest assumptions about the way the world works to foresee a decision which could have been missed or denied. So for an organisation, scenarios provide a common vocabulary, giving an effective basis for communicating complex conditions and options. And by recognising the warning signals, the threats and opportunities of the future, we can hopefully avoid surprises and adapt and act effectively. So that's what scenario planning is about and why it's important. What do you think the process is involved, or what are the steps that need to be taken in terms of actually planning and planning a scenario, or scenario planning implementation? So stop the video for a minute and just take a few minutes to think about that. So when we're implementing scenario planning, we need a cross-functional team who is able to then identify and monitor the issues. And employees are encouraged to participate by offering some incentives. So step one in the process is really understanding the effects of external factors on the business. And these can be technology driven, for example, new products, IT integration, or political, for example, deregulation, instability, or economic, such as sudden downturn or a boom, or competitive positioning, so moves of competitors, for example. Then step two, once we've understood these effects of external factors on the business, is actually classifying these issues by the supportive record or documents. And then we can determine the uncertainty and kind of impact of these issues. And then step three in the process is analysing and problem solving as per A, B, C and D in the following figure, which I'm about to discuss and show you. So the A, B, C and D part is all about understanding what level of uncertainty are we operating in. So is it a high level of uncertainty? Is it a low level? And what is the impact, high to low? So then we can then come up with this matrix, which then separates it into 4 quadrants. Where quadrant A is all about discarding, B is about keeping a close watch, C is about using it for long-term planning, and D, where you've got high impact and low uncertainty, is our areas of highest concern. So the D category, high impact and low uncertainty, are these areas where we need to give them our highest priority. And these need to be addressed immediately and more cautiously. So all employees must first focus on these issues when we're talking about scenario planning. The B category were high risk issues which need to be observed closely and monitored strictly because of high uncertainty. The C category was low impact, low uncertainty, and these issues can be used for long-term planning. And the A category was because of high uncertainty and low impact to the organisation, these issues can be discarded for the time being. So the analysis and problem solution can be done by an individual or by a team, depending upon coverage and importance. So all ideas and analysis should then be substituted to the cross-functional strategic teams for further analysis and strategy making. A acronym that you may be familiar with is called ETOP or ETOP, which is known as the Environmental Threat and Opportunity Profile. So managers must be prepared to steer the organisation to a new direction or modify the strategy as per what's going on in the external environment. So the external environment appraisal leads to opportunities and threats, and the internal environment, or the appraisal of what's going on inside the organisation, will lead us to find out about the strengths and weaknesses of the organisation to face these weaknesses and capture the threats. So how does this work? So if we kind of base this in a flow chart, we can see that with our environmental threat and opportunity profile, we need to think strategically about the company's external environment, which we saw in the first couple of slides, and then also we need to think strategically about the company's internal environment. And then once we've done that, and the next part of the flow chart is then to form a strategic vision of where the company needs to head, and then identify some promising strategic options for the company. And then once we've identified many options, we then need to narrow it down and select the best strategy and business model for the company. One way we can do that is actually to conduct an environment survey. So the purpose of an environment survey is to understand what are the events and trends in the environment and project the future of the environment. It's also to identify the favourable and unfavourable factors in the environment from the standpoint of the organisation, and figure out the opportunities and threats hidden in the environmental events and trends, to assess the scope of various opportunities and find out the ones having the potential of becoming more promising businesses and pursue those. Another purpose of the survey will be then to kind of draw up the opportunity threat profile and formulate strategies in line with opportunities. So that's why we would conduct an environment survey. Some of the things we need to take into account with the survey is the scope of the survey, and to take into account things such as the macro environmental factors. So before continuing with the slides, why don't you just pause it for a minute and think about what are the macro environmental factors which are involved in this. See if you can make a list of anything that comes to your mind. So in terms of the scope of the survey, the kind of macro environmental factors that we might want to take into account are things such as the demographic environment. So the size of the population, the age distribution, the levels of literacy, the composition in terms of religion, the composition of the workforce, the household patterns, regional characteristics and population shifts. Another macro environmental factors are things such as the socio-cultural and environmental, the culture, language, education, traditions, beliefs, values, lifestyle and social class. The economic environment, so general economic conditions and conditions for the targeted population segment. What's the purchasing power? What's the consumer spending pattern? What's the rate of growth of economy and the growth of economy of the targeted sector? What's the rate of inflation? Interest rates, tax rates, price of materials and energy, the labour scene in terms of cost, skill and availability. And another factor that needs to be taken into account, as we saw before with PESTLE, was looking at the political environment. So what's the legislation that's in place? What's the regulating legislation? How stable is the government? What's going on in the media? What about in terms of the influence of social and religious organisations, pressure groups, lobbies, etc.? Other factors we need to take into account are things like the natural environment, so ecology, climate, endowment of natural resources, raw material, energy, And then, as in Pestle as before, in terms of technology, what are the options available? How cost effective are they? What about technology at the international level? What's the government approach in respect of technology and technological selection? As in Pestle, we mentioned the legal side, so corporate affairs, consumer protection, employee protection, corporate protection. What kind of product regulations are there? So controls on trade practices, for example, or protecting national firms. In terms of government policies, organisations need to understand government policies while setting and operating units, especially multinational companies who operate in various countries. So, for example, many multinationals prefer India over China due to India's legal environment. So those are some of the factors that we need to take into account in terms of the macro environment in which we are analysing and understanding. And then there are more environmental factors specific to the business concerned, and that can be things such as the market demand, so the nature of demand, whether it is seasonal, is it related to a specific event, is it repetitive, is it based on demand, what's the demand potential, what's the current level of demand, will there be changes in demand? What is the consumption of the consumer patterns? Where are the buying habits? Is there an invasion of substitute products, for example? Other things we need to take into account is consumer. So as we know, we are consumers and our tastes and preferences keep fluctuating and changing, and that needs to be monitored by organisations on a continual basis. So there needs to be some kind of perpetual analysis of customer demands and customer tastes and needs. So a customer analysis is required. Who is the customer? What needs are served by the product and what needs are envisaged by the customer? It also needs to be analysed. Other factors such as purchasing power, what is the buying motive, what are the buying habits, the attitudes, lifestyle, brand awareness, brand loyalty, who is the nearest competitor, what is the customer's reaction to upcoming new products. All of these areas related to consumer demands and tastes and preferences need to be taken into account. Further environmental factors specific to the business are things such as the industry and competition. So do we have a knowledge of the industry and the competition? And that is absolutely fundamental in developing strategy and understanding the industry and analysing the industry. So the study of demand, consumer, industry and competition is normally an ongoing activity. We mentioned government earlier, so this is really important in regulated economies, but even more so in the free economy. So the government plays a role as a large purchaser. The government offers subsidies. It protects home producers. It bans fresh entries. It bans products. So sometimes the government itself is a large supplier and regulates the market. So government policies have a huge effect on the socio-economic conditions. We mentioned the suppliers earlier, so things that we need to take into account in terms of supplier-related factors is the fact that suppliers as a group have their own bargaining power and they can influence cost scarcity, they can influence cost, and the scarcity of raw materials can affect output and deliveries. So supplier becoming manufacturer is always a threat. So monitoring the supplier environment helps in making a decision of integrating or outsourcing. We mentioned Porter in various sessions and ways of understanding his competitive strategies and the variables that he looks at. There's also another model that's very useful in understanding the level of competition, which is called Porter's 5 Forces analysis. So this is basically a framework that tries to analyse the level of competition within an industry and business when actually implementing strategy development. So it draws upon industrial organisational economics to derive 5 forces that determine the intensity of the competition and therefore the attractiveness of an industry. And attractiveness in this context refers to the overall industry profitability. So an unattractive industry is one in which the combination of these 5 forces acts to drive down overall profitability. So a very unattractive industry would be one approaching pure competition in which available profits for all firms are driven to normal profit. So this analysis is associated with its principal innovator, who we've mentioned before, Michael Porter of Harvard University. So let's have a look a little bit more at Porter's 5 forces model. So we can see here we've got right in the middle the industry competitors, so the rivalry amongst existing firms. And then we've got these different forces. So we've got the potential entrants that are going to come in, the threat of new entrants. We've got this threat from buyers, so the bargaining power of buyers may change, and that's going to be a threat to us. We've got the threat of substitute products or suppliers, so another one of 5 forces is the suppliers, and also the bargaining power of the suppliers. So, and at the end of the day, the biggest one right in the middle there is really to do with the rivalry, the industry competitors. What is the rivalry amongst existing firms? So, what do you think are the forces shaping competition in an industry? So, according to Porter, a firm will develop its business strategies in order to obtain competitive advantage. Makes sense, doesn't it? So, it wants to increase our profits over our competitors. And it does that by responding to 5 primary forces, as we've just seen in the diagram. So we saw right in the middle there that you've got rivalry amongst existing firms, which is about jockeying for position. We've got this threat of new entrants. We've got the bargaining power of buyers and customers. We've got the threat coming from potentially substitute products. And we've got the bargaining power of suppliers. So according to Porter, these 5 factors shape competition and determine attractiveness or profitability in an industry. So sizing up competition within a factory, for example, is not enough. All forces shaping the competition and survival of an industry must be sized up. We should know which of these factors are strong and how they work in its industry, how they will affect the firm in particular, and how to adjust one's position to defend or overcome or take advantage of these forces. The company positions itself so as to be at the least vulnerable to competitive forces, while exploiting its unique advantage, its cost leadership, for example. So a company can also achieve competitive advantage by altering those competitive forces. And these 5 forces of competition influence the firm's strategy. So the 5 competitive forces model provides a solid base for developing business strategies that generate strategic opportunities. In fact, the strategy should be formed in such a way to influence all these forces in favour of the firm. So the strategy should be formed to build defence against these forces and finding a position in an industry where the influence of these forces is weakest. So in his recent study, Porter, in 2001, re-emphasised the importance of analysing those 5 competitive forces in developing strategies for competitive advantage. And analysing the forces illuminates an industry's fundamental attractiveness, exposing the underlying drivers of average industry profitability, and provides insight into how profitability will evolve in the future. One of the 5 forces was all about rivalry amongst existing firms and this idea of jockeying for position. So industry members undertake more aggressive and more frequent actions to boost their market standing and performance. This makes rivalry stronger. So rivalry is stronger in slow-growing markets, and more numbers of competitors and competitors who are equal in size and capability makes the rivalry stronger. Rivalry increases as products of rival competitor become more standardized, giving good reliability. And rivalry also increases as it becomes less costly for buyers to switch the brand, which makes sense. Also, rivalry will increase when competitors play some kind of price war and other competitive weapons and use those to boost their market share. And of course, rivalry is strong when numbers of competitors are less than 5. Rivalry will increase when strong companies outside the industry acquire a weak firm in the industry and launch very well-funded and aggressive moves to transform the acquired company into a major contender. Rivalry will be weak in fast-growing markets, And rivalry is weak when there are so many rivals that the impact of one's action is thin and sort of thin on and spread over span. So this is what happens in terms of when an organisation is kind of jockeying for position and when rivalry will increase. What do you think then are the weapons that an organisation has at its disposal to combat this rivalry? So stop the video at this point and just take a few minutes out just to ponder that question. So in terms of the typical weapons to combat rivalry are things that we see time and time again, such as lowering prices. We see organisations which then offer more or different features. We see organisations which offer things such as better product performance with higher quality, stronger brand image and appeal. They start to offer a wider selection to customers to choose from in terms of models and styles, a bigger and better dealer network, which can be quite attractive, and offering much better customer service capabilities. So these are all the kind of weapons in the armory to combat rivalry. And what do we notice in terms of new entrants? When will they be potentially stronger and when will they be weaker? So we talked about new entrants earlier, but what do we notice in terms of when they will be strong and when will they be weak? So in terms of threats of new entrants will be stronger when candidates have resources that make them a formidable contender, entry barriers are low, newcomers can expect good returns, buyer demand is growing rapidly, the industry is unwilling or unable to stop new entrants, and then the threats will be weaker when the opposite is in place. So when we've got the entry barriers are high, entry candidates are very low in numbers, when the existing industry is itself struggling for profits, when the industry outlook is uncertain and risky, when buyer demand is stagnant or slow, and when existing industry members have a sort of a strongly contest and do not allow newcomers to settle. So what about us as buyers and customers? When do we, as buyers and consumers, have more bargaining power? So stop the video for a minute and just think about those situations when you've been a buyer or you are a buyer or a consumer, and when do you have more power in that sphere? So us as buyers and customers tend to have more bargaining power when the number of buyers is small and when a buyer is particularly important to the seller. So when the cost of switching a brand is low to the buyer, when the buyer demand is low and sellers are plentiful, when buyers are well informed about the product prices and costs, we have much more bargaining power. When the buyer is capable of backward integrating and making the product by themselves, and when buyers have discretion in whether and when to purchase the product, and when the buyer is large and can demand concessions. That's when all the power is in our favour. However, it's not in our favour when we are making infrequent and small purchases, when the cost of switching to other brands is actually quite high, and it's a seller's market, and therefore brand reputation is important to the buyer. So what about the threat from substitute products? So when substitutes are readily available and attractively priced, when the buyer view substitutes products at a par or at the same level in terms of quality, performance and other attributes, and when costs are low to the end users to switch to substitutes, these are the situations when the threat is there from substitute products. What about the bargaining power then of suppliers? We've thought about us as consumers and buyers. What about suppliers? When do they have more or less bargaining power? So bargaining power of suppliers is really around when major suppliers can have sufficient bargaining power to influence the terms and the conditions in their favour. So the item supplied is a commodity that is not readily available from other suppliers in the market. When few large suppliers are primary suppliers of a particular item, so suppliers can have a cartel. When it's costly or difficult for a buyer to switch to new brands or alternative items. When need items are in short supply, when a supplied item has a differentiation which enhances it in some way in terms of the performance of the final product. When certain supplier supplies items and has possibilities of cost savings to industry members on account of its added quality features or services. And the bargaining power of supplier is weak when backward integration is possible. So when the buyer is a major customer and when there are many suppliers available. We've all come across the term SWOT analysis. We mentioned it a couple of slides earlier. So when we conduct a SWOT, we're identifying the company resources strengths and competitive capabilities. We're also looking at it internally from the viewpoint of its weaknesses and competitive deficiencies. And then we're looking outside what is going on in the external environment and identifying the company's market opportunities and any potential threats to the company's future well-being. So once we've conducted our SWOT analysis, the next step will be to draw conclusions concerning the company's overall business situation. And then once we've done that, we need to rank all factors from exceptionally weak to exceptionally strong and find out where is the business attractiveness. And then we're in a position to identify attractive and non-attractive aspects of the company's situation. Once we've done that, the next stage in the SWOT analysis will be to plan actions to improve company strategy. So we will use the company's strengths and capabilities to overcome the weaknesses, hopefully, and we will pursue those opportunities that are suitable to the company's strengths and competitiveness and try to correct the weaknesses that affect our abilities to take advantage of market opportunities. And then we can use the company's strengths and capabilities to lessen the impacts of important external threats. So in terms of the factors to look for in a SWOT analysis, if we want to look at our potential resource strengths and capabilities, the things that are kind of going to give us power and revenue will be around things such as a powerful strategy and core competencies, something which makes us distinctly different, so distinctive competencies or a very strongly differentiated product. We may have competencies and capabilities that match with key success factors of the industry. So that's going to bring us some kind of revenue and financial power. We may also have a very strong financial condition, which will provide ample resources, or maybe a very strong brand image, or a very attractive customer base. Perhaps our organisation has superior technological skills. The quality of the product could be excellent. We may have patents and intellectual capital, which is superior to other organisations, or maybe capabilities around innovation that other organisations don't have. We may have a cost advantage in terms of strong advertising and promotion. We may have very strong supply chain management capabilities, very strong customer service capabilities, and maybe a wide geographical coverage and a kind of a strong global distribution network. Potentially also maybe we have strong alliances or joint ventures and collaborations. So all of these areas are potential resource strengths and capabilities. Weaknesses, though, and areas which could be disguised as or just described as competitive deficiencies, could be that maybe our organisation is lacking clear strategic direction. Maybe the resources aren't matching the key success factors. Maybe there's a lack of core and distinctive competencies. We're not really sure how we are distinct in what we do and what we do well. Maybe we have a weak balance sheet, or maybe we have heavy debt or low resources. Maybe our product line compared to rivals is very narrow. Maybe our brand image is quite weak. Maybe we have a weak dealer network. Maybe our product quality isn't very good. Maybe we lack in the areas of research and development and technological know-how. Maybe we have a lack of management depth. Maybe we lose market share because whatever reasons. Maybe we are behind in our e-commerce capabilities. Maybe our internal operation doesn't work so well, so we've got internal operation issues, or maybe facilities which are outdated and obsolete. And maybe we've got a plant capacity where we're not fully utilising it, so it's not running at full capacity. These are potential weakness and competitive deficiency areas. In terms of opportunities, so the O of the SWOT, potential market opportunities could be things such as sharply rising buyer demand. So there may be a buyer demand which is on the increase. It could be that we are starting to serve new market segments or new sets of customers. Maybe we're expanding to new geographical markets, which gives us new exciting opportunities. Or maybe we're expanding our product line and our range of products to meet market demand. Perhaps opportunities are coming along in the form of online sales or e-business. Maybe we've got some kind of integration which is either forward or backward. Maybe we're overcoming trade barriers and capturing new foreign markets, which is opening us up to new market opportunities. Maybe we're acquiring rival firms. Maybe we're entering into alliances and partnerships and collaborations, or potentially maybe we're exploiting new technologies. So those are potential market opportunities. And then what about threats then? So threats from the external environment could be things such as increased competition amongst rivals, which is in growing intensity. Maybe the market is just slowing down. Maybe there are a whole load of entries of new potential rivals. Maybe we're losing sales to substitute products. Maybe the growing power or the growing bargaining power of customers and suppliers is increasing, as we discussed earlier. Maybe as consumers we know that maybe there's a bit of a shift in buyers' needs and tastes because that is constantly changing, so that's an external threat. Perhaps the adverse demographic change is beginning to reduce demand. Maybe there are restrictive trade policies on the part of foreign governments, and maybe there's new regulations and requirements which are going to cost us quite dearly. So all of those areas are potential external threats that we need to take into account when we're conducting our SWOT analysis. And as you can see here, then we can then plot those in the SWOT analysis according to strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. And we then will divide that into what we see from the internal side, so because what we're looking at, strengths and weaknesses internally, and then opportunities and threats would be what we see externally. And then we can see where we have power and where we have very high and strengths and competencies. And we can see then those are the positive aspects, and then we can see what's going on the negative side that we kind of need to mitigate in terms of these deficiencies. Okay, so that's brought our session to an end. So we've looked at all the tools and factors involved in analysing an organisation's external environment, which is highly important, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session, in session 9. Thank you very much.